personalist who talks about the individuum as the heart uniqueness as the heart of personal existence. The other ones don't do that, and I have a quote there. So there's a uniqueness, that I'm using the word in two different ways, to the way Shaler talks about the uniqueness of persons, which is not present in any other of the personalists. And that is what comes through the writings of John Paul II, especially his pastoral ones, like I just read to you, and some other theological texts that I've collected. This unique, okay, I have a little bit more here. He's not talking here about noticing that each person has a rational nature. He's talking about that incommunicability, which I mentioned before. If this text doesn't show his deep indebtedness, the one I just read to you, to Max Scheler's personalism, then I don't know what to say. John Crosby has recently, okay, I just told you that, so let's skip over here. So the Pope says he became deeply aware of this uniqueness from within the cultural horizon of contemporary personalism. And who is the contemporary personalist he studied the most? Scheler. In his introduction, Dr. Wallerstein quotes a line from Karol Wojtyła's habilitation thesis, which reads, "A theologian cannot be a phenomenologist." Dr. Wallerstein seems to interpret it as a kind of wholesale rejection of the personalist, realist, phenomenological school that Wojtyła studied. But whatever the meaning of that sentence is, the interpretation that Dr. Wallerstein gives is problematic because it is flatly contradicted by the Pope in every book he published since his dissertation. And as I mentioned, I collected several texts. Finally, in the same introduction that we're talking about, Professor Wallerstein sets up a kind of axis of thinkers, which goes Roger Bacon, René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, Max Scheler. And he attributes to this axis of thinkers the causal foundation of the mechanized, dualistic worldview that saturates our current Western world. The theory of this axis of thinkers can be seen throughout Wallerstein's introduction, but he gives it its precise formulation on pages 94 and 95. For confirmation that this is indeed Wallerstein's theory, this axis in the way I presented it, one can read the very helpful article-length review of the introduction by Dr. May, who's here. It's very helpful to understand Dr. Wallerstein's introduction, helpful points and good. But he also, Dr. May also in one section, understands Wallerstein exactly in the way I just presented it. So there's another expert who sees this the way I just presented it. So this assertion with respect to Scheler, especially in his second period, that he's the foundation of dualism and so forth, seems to me to be at least exaggerated, but perhaps not even right. I will end my remarks by reading to you a passage by Scheler himself. And we will hear his own words, Scheler's own words, not only on this topic, but he will say something about Kant and Descartes that corrects Dr. Wallerstein's placing him on that axis. Scheler described the proper mode of relating to the world as one that can be characterized in a preliminary and somewhat vague way as a surrender of oneself to the intuitional content of things, as a movement of deep trust in the unshakableness of all that is simply and evidently given, as a courageous abandonment of oneself in intuition and in the loving movement toward the world and its capacity for being intuited. This philosophy faces the world with a gesture of an open, outstretched hand and with the wide-eyed gaze of wonder. This is not the squinting, critical gaze that Descartes, with his universal doubt, casts on things, nor is it the eye of Kant, whose gaze seems to come from another world as it falls on things and cuts through them with a sense of having sovereign authority over them. The person who philosophizes out of this attitude has neither the anxiety born of the modern will to measure and calculate everything, nor the haughty sovereignty of the thinking reed, which in Descartes and Kant is the original source, the emotional a priori of all thought. Instead, the stream of being flows in and around this person, reaching all the way to his spiritual roots. He is familiar with the beneficent character of this stream of being, that the stream of being has, as such, and even prior to its particular contents. It is not the will to dominate, to organize, to determine unequivocally, and to define that animates his every thought, but rather a movement of sympathy, or granting space to being, of welcoming an increase in the fullness with which the things of the world, for the one who gives himself over to knowing them, ever and again escape from the grasp of human reason and exceed the limits of our concepts. Thank you. So we're getting the microphone, but you can, someone can, if you have any questions or thoughts, someone can go now while he's setting it up. Dr. Mayes has. Oh. Don't forget to say your name and where you're from.
My name is William May, and I'm from the United States of America, and I really appreciate it, learned a lot from your paper. I'm not qualified to comment on your debate with Dr. Waldstein. I'm more interested really in what you had to say. By the way, that essay has already appeared in the Indian Journal for Family Studies. Okay. Great. But anyway, I was fascinated by the remark that in vitro fertilization flows from a Puritan understanding of sex. I thought that was very fascinating. And I think that for our contemporaries, it certainly does. Because they're utilitarians. They look upon marriage as simply something of utility, as a way of getting new, human beings. And of course, they look upon IVF as even a better way of doing it, because here you end the reproductive roulette, and you can now choose the products, you might say, let's say what the material that goes into the product, that's the baby, because the baby's not a person, because it's just a body, it's not a person, because it's not a conscious subject aware of itself, the unborn child. So it fits in perfectly with contemporary dualistic understanding of the human person. So, but what struck me, though, is that Wojtyla, in Love and Responsibility, what he considered this idea was, I think, criticizing St. Augustine, who had a rigoristic interpretation of sex, because he explicitly says in De Bono Coniugale that some things are good in themselves, such as life, health, and friendship, and other things are good as means to things that are goods in themselves, such as food, medicine, food for life, medicine for health, and marriage for friendship. So he explicitly called marriage an instrumental good, to get children. And the main thing is that marriage is the invention of God, so that children know who their fathers are. And it's particularly the friendship he was concerned with, too, that toward which marriage is a means is a friendship between fathers and sons, not so much between his husband and wife. As I understand him, I might be wrong on that.
You're saying that's the Augustinian view that Wojtyla is criticizing?
I think, yes. I think he doesn't explicitly refer to that, but certainly Augustine had that rigoristic view. And I think what John Paul II does is to show that marriage is itself good in itself, and provides a reason. Being married gives you a reason why you would then engage in the conjugal act, because it expresses the unity of the persons, as you brought out in your paper, makes them literally to be one flesh, and that's precisely why, for example, the church would hold that impotence is an impediment to marriage, because an impotent person can't do what married persons are supposed to do, namely to give themselves in this unique kind of act. And this is precisely why same-sex persons can't marry, because they can't do what married persons can do. So I thought that was a very interesting part of your paper. Thank you very much. Yep.
Thank you. And,
Christopher West from the USA. First of all, I want to commend you and Dr. Waldstein for showing all of us how to disagree and love one another. This is yes. So important for the whole movement now unfolding in the theology of the body studies and promotion. If we look a little bit at history, another movement, natural family planning, for example, how many people within that movement can't even sit in the same room together when they disagree? And we are on the same team here. We got the whole world fighting against us, and the infighting that so often happens among us not only destroys us, but is a terrible counter-witness to what we claim we're all about. So I thank you for that witness. It's so important for us all. I want to talk about a quote from Dr. Waldstein's paper that I think can shed some light on your discussion. This is from the Holy Father, TOB 117, paragraph 3, where he says, Ephesians 5 is personalistic in the full meaning of that word. Well, that prompts the question, what is the full meaning of that word, personalistic? And I'm wondering here if some of the disagreement is of a semantical nature. What is the meaning of personalism? You spoke of it as a contemporary philosophical movement, and there is clearly the sense in which we can talk of that. But in what sense is the Holy Father saying Ephesians 5, a text written years before, obviously, the contemporary philosophical movement of personalism, in what sense is the Holy Father saying this is a personalistic text in the full meaning of that word? I don't know if you have a comment, and Waldstein even has a comment. I'd love to hear both of your perspectives.
Well, we're actually right now engaged in another via email discussion about this uniqueness of the person. I think the fullness of the person could be expressed in many more of the ways than I said today, but all those things today about the inner life of persons and so forth is the way philosophers in Western history have attempted to express this inner life, their rational nature. I won't go through more describing the rational nature, but the point that we're currently in a bit of disagreement about is this uniqueness idea. When I said you don't meet another rational intellect when you make a new friend, you meet a person, I think that means, and this is something unique to Shaler and Crosby, great original developments of this. Of course, poets always knew this. It takes philosophers a long time to catch up. But this uniqueness of a person is surely part of that fullness, which is the reason why you love all those kinds of love, by the way, not just betrothed love, but parent-child love, or sibling love, or friendship love. It seems to me begin because of a glimpse of this uniqueness of the person. And then that has this interesting dimension that love, we think of love typically as a rightly feeling dimension to love, an affective dimension which wells up in us and goes out towards the other person. But surprisingly, love also has a cognitive power. You will never, the only way to know this uniqueness of a person is to love a person. And also, it's like you catch a glimpse of their uniqueness, then you love them. Then this love enriches your ability to grasp more deeply the uniqueness, and then that makes you love them more. It goes, this fullness, I think the fullness of the inner subjectivity of persons in all these various ways was focused on by Max Scheler, Edith Stein, Dietrich von Hildebrand, and the others in a way that it had never really been done before. So that would be a whole other conference.
Now, when you say never really been done before, didn't St. Paul, isn't this what John Paul II is saying, that St. Paul did it here in Ephesians 5?
Well, then I think we would make a distinction maybe between, so like I just said about poets, I'm not saying that human beings who loved each other 2,000 years ago didn't experience everything I just talked about.
Right.
They did. I'm saying something a bit more narrow. I'm just saying that now you have some philosophers who decided to philosophize about what everybody already knew.
Right.
And so if you find a text of St. Paul that is packed in a way with that, I think the way to interpret what Wojtyła is saying there is, yes, Paul knew this.
Yeah.
And now we understand it and more fully in books. That's
helpful, thanks.
Sure. Are we out of time? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Katrina was first. You're just closer to the mic, and then you, yeah.
Katrina Zeno, Women of the Third Millennium from Phoenix, Arizona. The discussion today seems to have evolved primarily around personalism. The struggle that I'm having is that we haven't talked at all about phenomenology. And it seems to me that the figures that we're talking about, that the element that John Paul II drew from them is this understanding of phenomenology, and that one of his brilliant contributions, as we all know, is using phenomenology as his system of philosophy in the way that Thomas Aquinas used Aristotle. So I'm a little confused as to where phenomenology falls in this disagreement, and if perhaps that's not a third principle that could be a unifying place and also shed some distinction.
I think maybe a quick way to answer that also would be another conference, but a quick way maybe to answer it is maybe at the beginning with Husserl and Franz Brentano and all them, they called themselves phenomenologists. And then later, you could say we had this profound focus with this phenomenological method on persons, and also during that time. And so when you got to like the Polish personalism and so forth, and Lublin, people started changing the way they spoke to personalism. So now it's hard to actually pick one word to get this. Maybe you could say realist, phenomenological, Christian personalism. It's all one thing. But the branches of phenomenology went off, like Husserl, unfortunately, at the end of his life. Became more subjectivistic in the worst sense than even Immanuel Kant. So there's a strain of the phenomenologist, which is typically represented by Shaler, especially his second period, Edith Stein, and Dietrich von Hildebrand, which stayed faithful, as you just heard in the quote I read at the end of my paper, to the objectivity, goodness, and truth of reality. And then they started to have this narrow focus on the subjectivity of persons, which is a dimension of objective reality. It just happens to be inside us, not over there. That's what I would say, a short answer. Yeah, you probably should go there. Well, this, I guess, will have to be the last. Oh, I'm sorry, you first, and then.
Petar Krešimir Hodzić from Croatia. In the light of the middle part of your intervention regarding the donation, self-donation, and my interest and attraction to theology of the body, to put the new interdisciplinary field of prenatal and perinatal education, psychology, and health into the frame of theology and anthropology, I would like to ask you a question regarding something that could be called the cascade of self-giving acts, starting with the conjugal act.
The what? The first?
Cascade of the self-giving acts.
Cascade.
Cascade, yes.
Thank you.
Starting with the conjugal act, followed by the act of giving birth, and then followed by the act of breastfeeding. That biologically all three of them are marked as expression of the body by the secretion of the oxytocin, both in the brain, actually of all sides, that going into relation husband and wife, and then mother and child. So could we make a link between all those three self-giving acts? And I apologize for my ignorance. To my knowledge, I only know the last part regarding the breastfeeding, that in the recent book Sheila Kipley, Catholic Motherhood and Breastfeeding, established, but I never read something that is regarding the act of giving birth, and if you can reflect on that.
Well, I haven't read that book, although I know the Kipleys. And I'm not going to be able to give you an expert here. I'm going to claim, like Dr. Waldstein did, the realm of ignorance in me. However, two things that I would say is, one, of course, not only the love that is expressed in the conjugal act, but the whole relationship. I think it's pretty clear that children already in the womb, if their parents are fighting all the time, are going to have problems, and especially and after they're born and so forth. So what I would say to what you just said is that is exactly an example of the way we could assimilate and then develop in a way that hasn't been done yet. It'd be a beautiful thing to do. That's what you should do. You should. So, okay, this last one, and then we're going to break for Mass. I need this.
Because people will need it.
We could do that.
Because tomorrow is 12:15 anyway, so.
Okay, we'll do that. We'll do that. Okay.
My name is Heather Leger. I'm currently in Rome at the John Paul II Institute there, but I'm originally from Wichita, Kansas.
Okay.
And I first wanted to say thank you specifically for the language that you used in the first part of your discourse, because there's something I noticed the difference between both of your arguments is that the first is a lot harder to understand for a layperson and a person who doesn't necessarily have the background that all of you seem to have on this subject. And something I noticed is that by using a language like this, I think you learn that, at least that I have learned, that there are so many of these terminologies that is used in the theology of the body that as a layperson you assume you're supposed to know. But I noticed during your discourse that a lot of these things, such as what does it mean to give yourself, and just some of the basic ways that you really simplified this, I think it allows younger people and also people who don't necessarily have the background in academics or philosophy to enter into this argument coherently. And so I just wanted to say thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. What we're going to do now, Monsignor Hogan suggested that we start Mass at 12:15. I would like you to sit for just a minute. I'm sorry, I know we're tired, and I'm going to just have to make a few practical announcements or quickly, and then we'll have time to stretch outside and so forth. Und wenn ihr jetzt die Kirche jetzt aufstellen wollen, jetzt muss man nicht mehr filmen und Sie können dort gehen und die Kirche. Aha.